As Jesus called his first disciples, according to Matthew, he said, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." There are three parts to that. Number one, follow me, the call itself. And then, I will make you. How God transforms us into the people he wants us to be. And finally, fishers of men. The charge that we're to go out and make new disciples. The last few weeks we've been talking about the call, the follow me part. And now we're going to start turning the corner into what God does to train us, to develop us. I will make you. When Jesus calls us, there are really only three things we can do. The first, we can turn away. We can ignore him. You might say, he hasn't called me. I didn't hear anything. I think he did. You see, if you're thinking about it at all, God called you. Those aren't thoughts that come into our minds automatically. They're things that come from him. You may say, I don't believe in Jesus. I don't believe there is a God. You could say that. But for most people, I don't think that's true. They may have convinced themselves that they aren't, that they don't believe in him. But there's too much evidence for God. And I think all of us have deep in our hearts a knowledge, just a little bit, of who Jesus is. We don't know all the details. We need to learn those. We get that from Scripture, from teaching. But I think he's put that spark in us so that it will draw us toward him. Now, why do I believe that? I try not to believe something just because it sounds good. I want there to be some evidence. And I think there is. I'm going to give you this isn't a talk about, about how to support Christianity. This isn't a lesson on apologetics, but I want to give you just a little sliver of what I mean. About 100 years ago, there was a philosopher named Nietzsche, and he's famous for his statement, God is dead. Nietzsche believed that people were developing into a superhuman race, a race of supermen. And he felt that that religion, and especially Christianity, was holding us back, and that for that reason it was evil. And he hated all religion, but especially Christianity. And I decided that if I was, as a Christian, I should know something about Nietzsche and what he believed. So I read a book by him. The book I chose was The Antichrist. And through this entire book, it was basically just a rant and a rage about how horrible Christianity was. I wasn't impressed by any of his logic or any of his ideas. Instead, it was just him ranting about how evil all of these Christians were. He believed that Paul, who wrote, a third of the New Testament, was the most evil man that had ever lived. He believed that all of Jesus' apostles were evil men. But the interesting thing to me, and I think the most startling thing of the whole book, was that when it came to speaking about Jesus himself, all that Nietzsche could say is he was naive, and his disciples misled him. Really? Read the Bible, read the gospel accounts of what Jesus said and did, and tell me, do you think that he was led by anyone? No, Jesus was a powerful man. And he was the one leading those discussions, not someone else. His disciples didn't lead him, miss or otherwise. But I thought it was interesting that the most negative thing that Nietzsche could say about Jesus was that, he wasn't very smart, and he was tricked and misled by his disciples. Now, I believe that Nietzsche, deep down in his heart, knew what Jesus really was. He may not have really known that he was God, but he certainly knew that he was unique and that he was good. I think you know that too. No matter what you do to try to convince yourself, and until you accept that and deal with that knowledge, it's going to come back and haunt you. You can become a fan. That's what most people do. That's the easiest. You'll say, but I'm not a fan. No, I try real hard to keep to keep all the rules. I read my Bible. I go to church, and I don't do any bad stuff. You're trying, if that's you, then you're trying to please God through your own power. That's not his way. You can't do that. When you try to please God through your own efforts and through your own strength, it leaves you in control. You have not submitted to God. You're trying to keep his rules and win his favor and stay in control. He tells us we are to submit to him. Or you can become a disciple. But I have doubts, you might say. Well, of course you have doubts. Everyone has doubts. In fact, Jesus' own disciples had doubts. In Matthew 28, we'll read verses 16 and 17. This is just before Jesus ascended into heaven. And his 11 disciples had come because he told them where to come. And these men were the ones who had known him best. They had lived with him for 3 years. They had watched him. They'd listened to him. They knew everything about him. They saw him die on a cross. And they saw him after he raised from the dead. And Matthew says, now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him. But some doubted. You hear that? His most trusted disciples doubted. But they didn't let that stop them. They didn't walk away. Instead, they changed the world. You see, God doesn't get angry with us when we doubt. I'll give you another example. This is from chapter 9 of Mark. And here, Jesus was coming with 3 of his disciples down from a mountain, and there was a commotion around where the other disciples were. And a man came up to him. This man had brought his son his son was demon-possessed. And in horrible shape, the father didn't know what to do. He had brought his son to the disciples, and he explained to Jesus that what the boy was going through. And he said, I brought him to your disciples and asked them to cast the demon out, but they couldn't. He said, if you can do anything, please have mercy on my son. And in Mark 9, 23 and 24, and Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible to one who believes. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe. help my unbelief. I love that verse because it shows what we are like and that God still accepts us. We believe to the extent that we can, knowing that God has to take us the rest of the way himself, though we don't have that strength. Faith is not the absence of doubt. Faith is walking in the way you believe you should walk, even when you do have doubts. I assume you've seen Peter Pan, a play or a movie. And there's a part in that play where Captain Hook has left poison for Peter to drink. And Tinkerbell sees that he's going to drink it, and she goes in front of him and drinks it herself to save his life. And she starts to die. And Peter turns to the audience and says, fairies die because people don't believe in them anymore. You've got to believe. Believe and Tinkerbell will live. And then he says, clap to show that you believe. Clap and Tinkerbell will live. And they clap, and then Tinkerbell gets stronger and lives. Cute fairy tale, but unfortunately, too many people believe that that's the story of faith. Oh, if you just believe it strongly enough, then it'll be right. No! If you believe a lie very strongly, then you're just very strongly wrong. That's not what faith is. You are never asked to have faith in something that isn't true. You are supposed to have faith in what is true. You look at all the evidence and you decide what you believe, and then you walk forward in that belief. Even when you don't understand it all, even when you still have doubts, you walk in what you believe to be true, but you always examine that, because we don't want to go off in the wrong direction, and God will help us understand. Well, ignoring God, your first option, really isn't much of an option at all. At some level, you know who Jesus is. And you can't unknow that. If you try to ignore that knowledge, it's going to stay with you. And it's going to haunt you until you do something about it. So what is that something? Well, you can be a fan. Well, that's what most people do. Always have. Most of the people who heard Jesus when he spoke on earth were fans. Well, sure they were fans. They watched him feed 5,000 people with 2 fish and 5 loaves. He watched them cast demons out. They watched him heal sick. He even raised a couple of dead guys. What is there not to love? In fact, just the Sunday before he died, he was entering Jerusalem. He was riding on the colt of a donkey. And the people were shouting, Hosanna. They were praising God. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. They were calling out to him. They were putting their cloaks down on the ground so that his donkey could walk on them. They were cutting palm branches out of the trees and putting them down for them to walk on. That's why we call it Palm Sunday. But the next Friday, 5 days later, what were they doing? They were crying out, crucify him. Because they loved him. They were really on his side until they weren't. Because that's what fans do. And fans really don't have any purpose. If you think about fans at a football game, they're the guys up in the big NFL games. They'll have their faces painted. They'll be wearing the team's jersey. They'll have big signs. They'll be yelling and they'll be cheering and they'll be thrilled when they make a touchdown, and they'll be excited when they win. They might even cry when they lose. But one thing you'll never see them do is get down on the field and actually help them win the game. Now, I know nobody would let them on the field, or they probably would try. But the point is, a fan identifies with the team. They don't help the team win. They just talk about how good they are. And that's what Jesus' fans were like too. Unfortunately, our churches are full of fans. And that's not the choice you want to make either. It makes us feel like we've done something, but we haven't. We haven't really served him. We haven't submitted ourselves to him. We have just become fans. Or you can become a disciple. The dictionary defines disciple as one who embraces and assists in spreading the teachings of another, an active adherent as of a movement or philosophy. That's a disciple. Another quote here: disciples are found in the world outside of the Bible. For example, among the ancient Greek philosophers, disciples learned by imitating the teacher's entire way of life, not just remembering the spoken words of the teacher. They would live with their teacher, with their master. They would copy everything he did. They would learn his thoughts, how he felt about things, so they could react in the ways that their master would. A disciple doesn't just cheer for the master, and he doesn't just learn about him. He gets to know him personally. A disciple doesn't just learn the rules, but he copies the master's life so that he can make decisions on how to act the way the master would make that decision in the same situation. Okay, there's a big question here though. It sounds like to really be a disciple, you have to live with the master. You have to be in close contact. How can you do that with a master who is dead, that died 2,000 years ago? Well, he did die 2,000 years ago, but he also rose from the dead. That is a fundamental belief of our faith. And even though this is not a lesson on apologetics or reasons to believe, I'll tell you, there's a tremendous amount of compelling evidence. We can talk about that later some other time. He promised before he died that his Spirit would live with us. He promised that the Holy Spirit would live in us, teaching us, developing us, making us into a new person. This whole thing wasn't new with Jesus. Jeremiah, 600 years earlier, had prophesied that this would happen. He said in Jeremiah 31:33, "For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people." That is how you become a disciple. You walk with the Spirit of God. You submit yourself to him willing to change, because he will change you. He will remake you. He'll change your identity into somebody new. Not completely new. People will still recognize you. But you will have those fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace. You will be acting more and more like Jesus. So, what are you going to do? You've got a choice to make. Are you going to walk away? I advise against that one. It's going to come back and haunt you. You can try. You can try to hide that truth, but I think you're going to have to deal with it. Are you going to be a fan? Well, that's what most people do. Like I said, our churches are full of fans. It's the easiest choice, and it makes you feel like you've done something. It makes you feel like you've dealt with the question, but you really haven't, because you're not in the game. You're on the sideline, watching, and you have no part in what's happening. You can be a disciple. Is that what you're going to choose? It's the hardest. It's the steepest path to walk. But it's the best. You see, you can't just follow the rules as a disciple. You have to work at it and learn to know the heart of Jesus, to know what he would really do, so that you can be like him. It is the hardest path, but I can tell you from personal experience, I made that decision 60 years ago. And I have not always lived up to it. I fail all the time. But God accepts me and continues to work with me. And I can tell you that in 60 years, I have never once regretted making that decision. And I hope you can say that when you are an old man or an old woman.